Hi. Today, let's see what it looks like when a student stops choosing. People imagine that losing belief in choice would feel liberating, as if the weight would lift, as if the pressure would finally ease. That fantasy survives because people confuse agency with control, and control with comfort. In practice, when the belief in choosing begins to collapse, the first thing that appears is not freedom, it is disorientation. This session that I'm talking about here didn't begin with philosophy, it began the way many do, with a student describing a decision they couldn't make, a pattern they kept choosing, a familiar frustration within themselves for not doing what they believed they should have done. I know what I should do, they said, I just don't do it. They could have been talking about 1,000,001 things, but they were talking about something specific. These patterns repeat and repeat and repeat. That sentence sounds ordinary, competent, reasonable. It's a sentence people use when they believe there's a self behind behaviour who is failing to operate correctly. At first glance, this looks like indecision. It isn't. It's a conflict, an internal conflict between the narrative and the mechanism. Spinoza knew this very well. He called this consternation, because part of us has a feeling of what it wants to do, and another part has a feeling of what it ought to do. We end up confused because these two, they oppose one another. So, let's carry on. As the student spoke, something became very clear immediately. Every explanation arrived after the behaviour. Every sentence followed the same structure. I decided because, I chose to because, I didn't choose to because. The explanations were fluent, psychologically sophisticated and convincing. But when the sequence was slowed down, there was no moment when a decision was actually made. There were, however, pressures, anticipations, avoidances, familiar bodily signals, habitual movements away from discomfort. But there was no point where a self surveyed the options and selected one. The chooser existed only in language, not in experience. When this was pointed out carefully, without argument, without correction, without offering an alternative explanation, the students stopped talking, not because they were confused, but because the narrative machinery stalled. Silence is often the first sign that agency is beginning to collapse, or that idea of agency anyway. That silence didn't last long. It never does. The student tried again, new explanations appeared, more refined this time. I guess I chose it because I was afraid. I must have decided not to act. I didn't want the consequences. Each explanation was an attempt to reinstall authorship. The story changed, the structure didn't. This is where most conversations stop. Therapy often stops here. Coaching almost always does. The explanation sounds reasonable again, and reasonableness is usually enough to restore comfort, but nothing has changed. The chooser has simply been rebuilt with better vocabulary. In this session, the rebuilt story wasn't accepted. The attention returned to the sequence itself. What happened before the thought, before the feeling, before the explanation? What actually occurred, moment by moment, without interpretation layered on top? And slowly, something else became visible. The decisions weren't being made, they were happening. This moment doesn't arrive as insight. It doesn't sound like free will doesn't exist. It arrives quietly, as a pause, a small, untheatrical recognition, and a quiet O. That O matters. It's the sound of narration losing its grip. And immediately after comes the reflex, judgment. So what's wrong with me then? So am I just lazy? Does that mean none of this is my fault? The questions came fast, carrying urgency and emotional charge. Notice the sequence. The chooser disappears, and judgment rushes in to replace it. This isn't accidental, it's structural. When authorship collapses, the mind looks for something to restore orientation. Judgment does that quickly and efficiently. Someone must still be responsible. Someone must still be at fault. If there's no chooser, judgment becomes the substitute. In this session, judgment wasn't argued with. It wasn't corrected. It wasn't soothed. It was treated as information, a signal that something fundamental had shifted and the system was trying to stabilise itself. As the session continued, something else appeared beneath the self-judgment. Not insight, not relief. Grief. Pure grief. Not dramatic grief, quiet grief. The loss of an image, the loss of imagination, the loss of an identity. The image of being the kind of person who could have done better if only they tried harder, no more, been stronger. And this is the moment most people avoid. Because without that image, there is no one left to punish and no one left to praise. No heroic self, no defective self, just causation unfolding. When you drop the blame, you can't blame other people either. So it's just there, sitting. This is often mistaken for nihilism. It isn't. It's the loss of moral theatre. No blame. Because there is no one to blame. There is no chooser to blame. The student didn't become passive. They don't disentangle. They became quieter, more attentive, less interested in fixing themselves, and more interested in noticing what was actually happening. That's the shift. Not motivation, not empowerment, orientation. When people stop believing they are choosing, they don't become reckless. They become less dramatic, less self-punishing, less blaming, less self-congratulatory. Behaviour becomes quieter, more consistent, less driven by identity repair. But only if judgment is not rushed back in. And that's why this work is so difficult to do alone. The mind prefers guilt to ambiguity, blame to silence, judgment to causation. Without containment, the chooser is rebuilt quickly, often in therapeutic language, often in kinder terms, but it's rebuilt all the same. This session didn't end with a conclusion. It ended with observation, with the student noticing how explanations arrive after behaviour, how judgment surged when silence appeared, how quickly the story tried to return. That noticing is the work. This is what it looks like when a student stops choosing. Not enlightenment, not freedom, contact. And if that unsettles you, that's not a sign you've misunderstood it. It's a sign you've understood. It's the same moment the student reached, the moment where the chooser goes missing and the mind looks around, unsure of what to do next. That moment is where this work actually begins. If you recognise yourself in this and don't know what to do with what's now visible, mentoring is the place where that recognition is worked with rather than explained away. Thank you for listening.